The you know the form in many ways is quite often driven for this aspiration to create the best daylighting and thermal comfort within the building, and so again that's a direct response to the sun. And it's interesting sometimes because it seems obvious, right? But we've seen so many buildings that are sort of deny the orientation relative to the sun, and then ultimately pay the price. And the classic example is if you went up to a school from say the 60s, which tend to have fairly generous glazing. Quite often it's a ribbon of windows across the facade, at least here in the Mid-Atlantic, and if the orientation is no good, and in almost any orientation, what you find is you look up at this expanse of glass on the building, and the shades are all down, and they're all down permanently, right? Because it's uncomfortable to be behind all that glass, both thermally, but particularly from a standpoint of glare. So what that's done is changed again the emphasis on orientation, making sure that we're typically here in the Mid-Atlantic trying to orientate instructional space either facing north or south, because we can control the sun more readily with shading devices or the building shades itself, and that certainly changes our site planning in almost every instance, from just being able to swing the building wherever we want, for other reasons, to really drawing it, into a massing, that emphasizes, that north-south orientation. And so Dunbar is one example of that. So it has a main academic wing, and it's oriented east and west, and then we could shade the south facade appropriately. The north facade is very open and glassy, and doesn't need shading because of that, and the light quality is quite good in the building, as is the energy performance. But even in the modernization projects, it's changing our architecture, because we just did modernize my local elementary school, the one right around the corner from my house, and it's one of those classic 1960s buildings that is 90 degrees out of proper orientation. So we have a lot of photographs of the shades pulled, and nobody ever sees out these generous windows, because it's just uncomfortable. So what we did was we put an external shading device on the facade, and took this sort of mundane box. It wasn't a very attractive building in the historic district, and ended up sort of animating the facade, I think, in a very interesting way with these horizontal series of tubes that took a building, I think, that most people thought was somewhat unattractive, and through a sustainable design shading strategy to optimize the daylight and minimize the heat gain, we ended up with an older building, I think, that now looks quite contemporary, as a result. So it had, a very dramatic aesthetic impact, on the building, and radically changed the thermal performance, and hopefully the daylight performance of the interior spaces behind that facade as well.